All right. So this lecture is about slavery in Arkansas. So even though Arkansas produced less cotton than many other southern states, its slave populations expanded very quickly. In one 10-year period, the number of slaves increased from less than 5,000 to more than 20,000. Pre-Civil War records claim the state's 11,000 slave owners had more than 110,000 slaves. Only a small percentage of slave owners, though, had 20 slaves or more. The majority of slave owners, only one family in five, had between 1 and 4 slaves. Union County and Chico County had the state's highest slave populations. Elisha Worthington of Chico County was the largest slave owner in Arkansas before the Civil War. He had 543 slaves on his more than 12,000-acre plantations. So I'm sure you've seen movies or TV shows or documentaries about slave life, and it's something that I can't possibly imagine. And if you do some research, you will find out that not all slaves had the same type of life. There were multiple ways or perspectives on slavery in terms of how slaves were treated. Some slave owners were nice, some owners weren't. There was just a wide variety of life as a slave. And you'd really have to talk to the survivors of that and read their oral histories to really find out what it was like for them. But in general, obviously, being a slave would have been pretty terrible. They had little or no control over their own lives. Most were forced at the threat of death or punishment to work from sunup to sundown for the benefit of the master. Some were given the shabbiest food, clothing, and housing, and almost no medical treatment for their physical ailments. Some slave owners separated children from their parents and husbands from their wives with no concern for their feelings. One Arkansas black woman remembers the horror she felt when she was sold away from her nursing baby boy. "I can't go off and leave my baby," she said, but her owner sold her anyway. Columbus Williams, a former slave born in Mount Holly, Arkansas, remembers his master was especially cruel. "Old Ben Hurd was my master. He whipped his slaves a lot. He would whip the women the same as he would the men, and he didn't have no church, no nothing. The black people never had no amusement. Wouldn't allow none of them to have no books, nor read, nor nothing. The slaves lived in old log houses, one room, one door, one window. They had cracks that let in more air than the windows could. They had plank floors, didn't have no furniture." So many slaves tried to fight back against slavery in a number of different ways. One form of daily resistance was called putting on old massa. Slaves who rebelled in this way would sometimes break hoes, plows, or other tools. Some might purposely track mud into the master's home, while others tried to hurt their owner's farming operations or household by performing their chores very slowly. Running away was another form of resistance some slaves used. Most, however, did not attempt to find freedom, but took off for a few days to rest or to visit friends or family members working nearby. Once a slave returned, punishments were sometimes terrible and sometimes mild. Punishments for slaves who did attempt to find freedom were usually much more severe. Masters and overseers often made examples of captured runaways in front of the other slaves. Some were branded with a hot iron or sliced with a knife behind the knees. A few even had their toes cut off. So one of the greatest fears of slave-owning families was that their slaves might rise up and kill them. Many of the women kept knives or guns by their beds. Some kept their dogs chained on their stairs or always nearby. They were constantly on the lookout for signs of rebellion. In places like Chico County and Lafayette County, the fear of a rebellion was always in the back of a slave owner's mind. Slaves in these counties outnumbered whites more than 3 to 1, meaning For every one white person, there were 3 black people, or slaves. Although slaves may have wanted to rebel physically against the minority of whites in the area, they never did. Some slaves, however, did kill or injure their masters or overseers, but in Arkansas, this type of violence was quite rare. So resisting slavery wasn't the only thing slaves did to try to have some control over their terrible situation. Singing and focusing on spiritual things were 2 of the most powerful tools slaves used to survive. Their songs often encouraged them to hope for a better future, if not now, then maybe in heaven. Songs taken from stories in the Bible reminded them of others who had survived great trials and suffering. One former slave named Frederick Douglass said, "I did not, when a slave, fully understand the deep meaning of those rude and apparently incoherent songs. I was myself within the circle so that I could then neither hear nor see as those without might see and hear. They breathed the prayer and complaint of souls overflowing with the bitterest anguish." The remark in the olden time was made that slaves were the most contented and happy laborers in the world, and their dancing and singing were proof of this fact. But it was a great mistake to suppose them happy, because they sometimes made those joyful noises. The songs of the slaves represented their sorrows rather than their joys. Like tears, they were a relief to aching hearts. So as you see here, I have posted a YouTube video of one of those very famous slave spirituals. It is a direct biblical reference to the slaves in Egypt and Moses freeing them. So let's listen. So this was sung by Louis Armstrong, who's a very famous black jazz artist from the early 1900s, mid 1900s, and certainly slave spirituals would not have been sung with any, especially in the field, I guess you could say, um, with any instruments. A lot of the time it would have been just voices. And if they did have, if slaves did have downtime, they would have perhaps made, if they were allowed, instruments for themselves. Other slave spirituals that you may have heard of is Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and what's the other one called? Nobody Knows the Troubles I've Seen. Those are two other famous ones. All right, so I wanted us to focus on one, I guess you could say, survivor of slavery who went on and lived, I think, a very productive and a productive life and successful life. This guy's name was Joseph Albert Booker. He lived from 1859 to 1926. And he was born a slave in Arkansas on the John Fisher Plantation at Bayou Bartholomew. By the age of 3, he became an orphan when his mother died suddenly, and his father was whipped to death for teaching other slaves to read. Now think about that for a second. Why would it be illegal for someone to teach a slave to read? Why would slave owners not want their slaves to be educated? Just think about that. Booker loved learning and studied hard to get an education after the Civil War. He attended the public schools in Ashley County, and at 17 he became a teacher on a local plantation. He also loved religion and was soon a licensed Baptist minister. Later, Booker attended Arkansas Agricultural, Mechanical, and Normal College, today's University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff. Eventually, he received his bachelor's degree from Roger Williams University in Nashville, Tennessee. Upon his return to Little Rock, he began preaching and was soon named as the first president of the new Arkansas Baptist College. He also began editing a black Baptist newspaper called the Baptist Vanguard. Booker was a strong leader who fought for civil rights but encouraged good relationships between blacks and whites. He focused on teaching all young people in Arkansas the importance of education. Throughout his life, Joseph Booker worked calmly to improve the lives of black citizens and bring harmony between the races. He and his wife were the parents of 8 children. So obviously he felt that education was important, probably because he wasn't allowed to have one and saw the value of it for later on in life. So obviously there was slavery in Arkansas, but there were a lot of events nationwide that made slavery obviously a bigger problem than it already was. So one of those issues was called the Compromise of 1850. In 1849, there was the discovery of gold. If you've ever watched football, you know that the San Francisco football team are the San Francisco 49ers. So there was a huge rush to California. And once there were so many people who lived there, they could apply to become a state. So Southern politicians were unhappy about California's petition to enter the nation as a free state. Okay? Because such an entry would disrupt the carefully planned balance created by the Missouri Compromise, which said if any state wants to come in below that, the Mason-Dixon line, then they'd be slave. If they went above the Mason-Dixon line, it would be free. Well, California was cut in half by the Mason-Dixon line, and so they didn't really know what to do. So Henry Clay, who came up with the Missouri Compromise, came up with another solution to America's newest problem. He suggested 4 possible acts, which Congress debated for almost 9 months. He said, or eventually, the Compromise of 1850 said that California would come in as a free state. Slave trade would be discontinued in Washington, D.C. New territories that would come in would decide if they wanted to be free or slave, meaning the people who live there would decide. And then strengthen the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act said that if a slave cross the Mason-Dixon line into a free state, they could still be caught and brought back to the slave state. Senator Clay's suggestions caused quite a stir in Arkansas political arenas. Some Southern Democrats, like Congressman Robert Johnson, spoke boldly against continuing within a union that did not recognize Southern rights. Governor John Roan of Arkansas did not think the compromise was fair. He also stated, "I would dissolve the union, for there is no security in it." What that means is that he would break up the union because it really wasn't unified. So he's leaning toward breaking away from the United States. But most Arkansans, although pro-slavery, still believed the Union was worthy of being preserved. Eventually, the new compromise passed, which temporarily ended the heated debate. So this next slide is sort of a map just to point out to you where the slave states were and where the free states and territories were, and that these Utah and New Mexico territory would, when they became states, the people of those territories would determine whether or not they wanted to be free or slave. So while Compromise of 1850 was going on, other things, just not in that year, but just during this time period, there were people who were trying to abolish slavery. Those people would be called abolitionists. And there were many ways of doing that, trying to abolish slavery or convince people to go against slavery. One of those ways was through writing. And one of the most famous books, I think, when it comes to slavery is Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. When she decided to write Uncle Tom's Cabin, she knew the story would make the horrors of slavery come alive for thousands of readers. She realized it would upset many people, including Southern slave owners. But while praying one day, she believed she was inspired to write the story. Once the book was published, it became an instant success, selling millions of copies in both the United States and around the world. The story told through the eyes of a slave opened the eyes of many people to the evils of slavery. It also fueled the growing division between people defending the practice and those who wanted it abolished. President Abraham Lincoln called Harriet Beecher Stowe the little lady who started the big war. Uncle Tom's Cabin, however, did not just point a finger at Southern slave owners. Stowe also wanted Northerners to understand they too had played a part in the great national tragedy of slavery. She reminded Northerners that merchants in northern cities had brought people from Africa and sold them as slaves in the United States. Many of these slave owners were some of the most brutal masters of all. She also believed that Northern politicians were responsible for allowing slavery into Western territories because they were willing to compromise. She believed both the North and South were guilty before God. So what do you think? Harriet Beecher Stowe believed that citizens in both the North and South were responsible for the cruel practice of slavery. Do you think she was correct? Do you think it was wise for Northern politicians to compromise with Southern politicians over slavery? I don't know. All right, so we have people writing stories that are bestsellers about slavery. We have laws that are being passed about slavery. Obviously, it's building up to what we know is coming, which is a civil war. Now, even though the cry by abolitionists to put a halt to the practice of slavery, Democrats continue to push for its expansion into Western territories like Utah. Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois created a bill suggesting that the Louisiana Purchase lands be divided into Kansas and Nebraska territories. The bill also promoted the idea of popular sovereignty. This is very important, popular sovereignty. And it suggested that the two new territories be allowed to make their own choice about slavery. Obviously, abolitionists and many Northerners were furious about the bill. Eventually, though, Congress passed what became known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The new act put an end to the previous restrictions created in the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850. Democrats were hopeful that slavery might now spread into the West. As national Democrats began to move their political goals forward, Arkansas Democrats were experiencing some important internal changes. The deaths of founding members of the family shifted its leadership into the hands of an entirely new generation of men. Men like Robert W. Johnson and Governor Elias Conway became the family's newest leaders. Even though some family members began pushing Arkansas to separate itself from the Union, most Arkansans were against such a drastic move. Many slave owners still wanted to be loyal citizens of the Union. Disagreements over slavery in the Whig Party, however, tore the organization apart, and its influence quickly faded from the state. Eventually, many former Whigs joined a new political group called the Know Nothing Party. The group was never widely popular in Arkansas and was against allowing immigrants, especially Catholics, into the country. So here is the map for the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Of course, you see where the free state or territories are in green, slave state or territory in yellow, open to slavery by principle of popular sovereignty according to the Compromise of 1850 in a light red, and then open to slavery by principle of popular sovereignty, Kansas-Nebraska Act in this area. And it gets pretty brutal up in Kansas. It's not good stuff. So another important event that contributed to the growing divisions across the country was the Dred Scott decision. A slave by the name of Dred Scott was taken by his master to live in a free state. Under the Constitution of the Free State, Scott could have petitioned for his freedom, but he did not. Later, he returned to live in a slave state where he continued to serve his master. When his master died, Scott offered to buy his freedom, but his master's widow would not accept his offer. Scott then tried to sue for his freedom. His long court battle was heard both before the Missouri Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court. Both denied Scott his freedom, stating that because he was a slave and not a citizen of the United States, he was not allowed to sue anyone. It was a great victory for Southern slave owners, but abolitionists and a growing number of Northerners were outraged by the decision. So now we have laws that are being passed to try to prevent slavery or compromise on slavery. We have abolitionists who are trying to abolish slavery through writing. We have even a slave going through the court process to try to gain his freedom. And now we have John Brown. He was also an abolitionist against slavery. He decided to use something different. He decided to use violence. Late one night, Brown and about 20 men marched into the United States Arsenal in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. They came with the hope of getting the rifles and weapons they needed to start a slave rebellion. Over the course of the night, Brown and his men killed a few workers and took several prisoners. Brown had hoped slaves in the area would flee their masters and join the rebellion. But that never happened. Eventually, Colonel Robert E. Lee and a group of Marines put an end to the violence. They broke down the door and captured the rebels. About 10 members of Brown's group were killed during the incident. A jury in Virginia found Brown guilty of treason. He was sentenced to death by a judge and was later hanged. Just before receiving his sentence of death, he spoke these words. "Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I say, let it be done. Basically, he said, fine, if killing me, hanging me, helps justify or free the slaves, then do it. So it seems almost impossible that progress could occur during a time of such great national turmoil, but in Arkansas it truly did. The first section of the Memphis and Little Rock Railroad finally opened for business. Freight and passengers could now travel between Hopefield and Madison along the St. Francis River. The wave of growth and prosperity across the state also boosted education, factories, farming, and even the state treasury. But it could not slow the turn of events that would soon follow. Arkansas and the nation were about to go to war. And that concludes this lecture. If you need to stop and rewind, then go for it. Thanks for listening. Hope you took good notes.